I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messengers God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today's guest, who is hopefully no stranger to you because you've been watching the show faithfully now for a few months, is Don Handrick, who is the resident teacher of the Tibetan Buddhist Center here in Santa Fe. And we're going to be talking about Atisha's 7 points of mind training. And, you know, you've been hearing me talk about this on previous shows. One of the things we're trying to do with our shows here is to give you a set of tools that you can work with in your life to help change the way your life is going. And, so we're doing them in a variety of different denominations, and we're doing this for Buddhism. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, but, just want to throw it out there. Buddha was the actual world's first psychologist. Long before Jung, long before Freud, there was Buddha. So we'll get to that. But today's prophetic topic is emptiness, whose essence is compassion. And this line is from a segment of Atisha's pit saying, which was compiled and translated by Robert Thurman in his book, Essential Tibetan Buddhism. The segment reads as follows, and it's a little lengthy, so stay with me. Again they asked, what is the highest teaching of the path? Atisha replied, the highest skill lies in the realization of selflessness. The highest nobility lies in taming your own mind. The highest excellence lies in having the attitude that seeks to help others. The highest precept is continual mindfulness. The highest remedy lies in understanding the intrinsic transcendence of everything. The highest activity lies in not conforming with worldly concerns. The highest mystic realization lies in lessening and transmuting the passions. The highest charity lies in non-attachment. The highest morality lies in having a peaceful mind. The highest tolerance lies in humility. The highest effort lies in abandoning attachment to works. The highest meditation lies in the mind without claims. The highest wisdom lies in not grasping anything as being what it appears to be. And what is the ultimate goal of the teaching? The ultimate goal of the teaching is that emptiness whose essence is compassion. So before we start, I know that was quite a bit to digest. If you would like me to send it to you, my email address will be running at the end of the show. Email me. I'll be happy to send you this quote because it is such a wonderful quote. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you because I've used up all my breath on reading this. And what is Atisha's 7 points of mind training, and how did it evolve? And let's give the viewing audience a little background on it. And we won't even. They know you. We don't need to do your background. How's that?
That's fine. So Atisha, about 1,000 years ago, came from India to Tibet. There was a whole story that I won't go into either about how Atisha ended up coming to Tibet. But he's known particularly for bringing kind of 2 approaches to practice and instructions, if you will, that were really quintessential to the development of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet. The Tibetan culture, of course, had been working with Buddhism for a while. They had a couple of centuries. But they, again, to quote Venerable Rabina, who I was quoting before the show, she said, they kind of lost the plot. Somewhere along the way, the Buddha's teachings had been somewhat distorted. And so Atisha was incredible for these 2 approaches that really help us to get back to what is the plot, what is it that we need to do in terms of practicing the Buddha's teachings. So the one is what's called the Lam Rim in Tibetan, or the stages of the path, and that's a whole approach that really all of the traditions in Tibetan Buddhism, all 4 schools, really adopted and took and have run with it, particularly the tradition I work with, the Gelugpa tradition. But the other set of instructions, the other approach, is what we call mind training, or lojong. Lojong is a whole corpus of teachings that Atisha brought with him that are really to help us to overcome kind of two fundamental misconceptions. And so they are both kind of talked about in this wonderful quote that you just gave. The very first one, and kind of what the root of our problem is in terms of what's driving the whole show, is a misconception about how the self exists. So right at the beginning, when there was this idea of the wisdom of selflessness and realizing selflessness. So the Buddha is basically saying that we have a misconception as to how we exist, but not just we, but everything in the world. And there's some sayings we'll get into shortly that have to do with this idea of acknowledging that things are like a dream, that we have sort of inferred some level of reality to things that really isn't there. And if we go into it deeper and analyze, we can find that the self doesn't exist in the way that we think it does at all. And a lot of that has to do with kind of thinking things have sort of concrete, independent identity, whereas everything is interdependent. Everything is constantly dependent upon other things for its existence. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well when we get into some of the sayings, because a part of the mind training is to address this fundamental misconception of self-grasping. The one that's kind of built upon that, and the one that is more where we can apply things perhaps at a more practical level, and that's where these sayings are really, really quite useful, is what we would call abandoning, the term that's used very commonly in the translations is self-cherishing. Self-cherishing, though, maybe it doesn't kind of give the full picture of it. One translation I read recently gave the term self-preoccupation, but it's a self-centeredness.
Yeah,
it's, where it all becomes about me. And this is the platform that we're all operating from, is thinking that everything is revolving around me and my happiness and my everyone else meeting my needs. And so this is obviously a concept that is problematic. If everyone is operating from this platform, then no one's needs generally get met. Whereas if everyone's operating from the opposite platform of being concerned about others, then everyone's needs get met.
So two quick statements. First is, if I start any statement with the word self, I'm already in error. And the other part is that self makes the parts greater than the whole.
Yeah. Exactly. Or even the whole greater than. I mean, because when we do acknowledge it, sort of there's a dependency upon parts, but then what we infer to be the whole, again, doesn't really exist in that way. A whole is a designation on the basis of parts. So let's use an example just to if we talk about the self. I think we even touched on this in the last time I was here when we talked about the Four Noble Truths and the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. This is the chief realization we have to get. So if we examine what we mean by I, this big capital I, we see that it's basically something that is related to always a mind and body. So we don't have a sense of I in regard to a chair or a plant or what have you. We have a sense of I in regard to what we call these physical and mental components, if you will. So when we go looking for where that I that seems to be able to set itself up as some independent sense of self, if that's somewhere among this collection of things that are physical and mental, we should be able to isolate it. We should be able to find something that is it. And is it not just at occasional moments, but all the time, because that's the way it feels, is that it has some constancy and is always there. But we find that when we look in the mind, we don't find anything that is specifically identifiable as being the I. And we look in the body, we can go through all the parts of the body, and once again don't find that any particular part of the body, nor even the body itself as a whole labeled on those parts, none of those are the I.
It's a construct of the ego.
Exactly. So we are labeling, and in the end, that is the subtlest way that we exist. And that's really the only way that we exist when it comes down to it. There certainly are causes and conditions, and again, parts to all of this. But the subtlest way that the self exists is as that label, that construction, mental imputation on the basis of the stuff that's sitting on this chair. So Lama Zopa's our teacher in the FPMT. He's known for saying that, that basically the only reason why we say I am sitting on the chair is because the mind and body are on the chair. But obviously we can do the same analysis with the body or with the mind, and we find nothing that is the mind in that concrete way. We simply look at mental moments that are designated mind, or components of the mind that end up getting designated as mind. And this is a very profound truth and a very difficult one to realize, but it has profound implications, because as you said, once we start with that concept of I, then we build up so much other exaggeration and fabrication on top of that just really distorts our whole experience.
And at the core of Buddhist teachings was really detachment.
Exactly. And so that detachment means detaching from our grasping to an I, clinging to an I at that very subtle level, as well as our attachment to all of the again, ways that we are misconceiving things and letting go of putting so much, again, layering on top of everything that exists. And this leads us to, fundamentally look outside of ourselves for things that satisfy us, because we're inferring all kinds of things erroneously, when in reality, what needs to be fixed is on the inside. Hence, mind training.
And basically, and I want to get right into that, but my understanding, and maybe it differs with each of the different schools, is that the nirvanic meditations were a series of 4 meditations that stripped away attachments to different parts of the self until there was no self, so to speak, attachment to self.
Right. I think in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition it's presented a little bit differently, but it's the same idea of kind of going through and really removing these misconceptions till we get to that fundamental truth, which the Buddha says can actually be known in a very experiential way without some of the constructs of the mind of conceptuality at all. And so these are the profound insights that great yogis have, where they strip away all of even the process that we're currently knowing by things. They know things in an absolutely direct way. And in that way, the truth is revealed to them much more profoundly, so that they never go back to misconceiving again, in a sense. So
let's jump in. Let me just we have 7 points of mind training, which are basically contain 57, I'll call them proverbs. We're going to try to, and we'll hopefully be successful on touching on all 7. There's no way we're going to do 57 proverbs, but the first point is preliminaries. You want to just address that?
Sure. So the preliminaries are often pointed out as being, in the tradition that I study, as 4 main points from the Buddhist teachings that we can really understand, that kind of set the stage for how mind training can be effective. The very first one is acknowledging what we would call sort of the preciousness, or the real valuable opportunity that we have with this human life. So, of course, in Buddhism, as in many Eastern traditions, there's a belief in reincarnation, and there's a belief that we end up in all sorts of states of existence which are not so conducive to spiritual practice. So in this human life, when we have the opportunity, we have a good intellect, we have access to these teachings, the important task at hand is to use this life well. The second of these 4 thoughts is recognizing that this life isn't going to last. And these are the meditations on death that reaffirm in our mind that death is certain, that there's no one gets out of here alive, as they say. And then secondly, that the time of our death is uncertain. It can come at any time. And this is the unstable nature of this existence. The third point within the death meditation is to really recognize what will be essential at the time of death, which is to what extent we've worked with our minds, to what extent we have actually changed our minds, because that's what we take with us, along with all the karmic seeds, imprints, what have you, into our next existence.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're basically saying is part of the lesson is to see that there is an essence. When he talks about that emptiness whose essence is compassion, but there is that essence that is part of, yet separate from the body. It is eternal, and it's affected by how I think, feel, and act in the body. So if I come to a place where I'm going to die, If I still stay attached to the life and don't see that the essence is eternal, I'm going to be walking one path, so to speak. And if I see that I'm going to go on and come back again, I'll be walking a different path.
To some extent. I guess there's a few points in there, and maybe one thing first is, when we talk about an essence, I think that this is really, when I was speaking earlier about kind of this self-grasping, it really comes down to understanding that there is nothing that we call sort of a fundamental essence, but rather there is a continuity of consciousness, and consciousness is comparable to what we would call the soul in our Western tradition of looking at something like the spirit. But the idea behind consciousness even is that it too is subject to the same analysis, and we don't find anything that we can pinpoint and say this is an intrinsic essence of consciousness. So it's a tricky thing. So we have to be careful to kind of not start thinking that there is something that we hold on to in some real lasting, permanent way. There's an eternality to consciousness as well, no beginning and no end. But certainly, like the point that you're making is that the craving that happens at death, the wishing to be embodied again, because it's very painful to leave this body after we've gotten quite used to inhabiting it. And so the consciousness is very much attached to being embodied. And this is one of the fundamental factors that drives us from life to life. But it has to have something to work with. And that's, again, the karmic seeds and the imprints that we leave that are the nourishing part of it is that craving, but the part of it that causes us to take rebirth is the karma. So in effect, we will continue, and the death process will be one that just perpetuates our cycle because we have that craving at the end of life again. But we also have the stuff that is capable of being nurtured by that craving. So when we actually realize, as I said earlier, these yogis who have this insight, they sort of cut the root of all that because there's nothing to sustain it any longer, because the ignorance is what gives rise to the delusions and the karma that are built on that. And so it's like a house of cards. It immediately falls
apart
once you don't have the basis of it, the foundation of it. But for us, who are, again, in this going back to these as preliminaries, we have to acknowledge that our death is a key point to meditate on, because if we don't have that awareness of some end to this very precious opportunity, and the awareness that we need to do something to be ready for that time and have done the work so that when we get to the end of life, we've got no regrets. We can go on with some future life insurance as to where we will end up and what we will be doing. So that's the second point of these four. The third is understanding the principle of karma, which I've already touched on. Maybe don't need to speak so much about it, but it's the fundamental law of cause and effect. And it does play a key role in a lot of Atisha's points about mind training. Because if we begin to understand how karma is operating all the time to produce whatever experience that we are having, then we understand that we are the creators of our own experience.
So would it be fair to say karma is created by having the concept of self?
The karma of samsara, which we would call basically, again, this gets into more technical teachings, but we call that's contaminated karma. It means it's contaminated by that affliction, by that fundamental ignorance. So as long as we have that mistaken idea, yes, we will keep creating this pattern, whether we get reborn into a nice state like a human or whether we get reborn as an animal. That's operative at some level, that ignorance. Once we start cutting that ignorance, karma is still an operative principle. It's basically the law of cause and effect, and the law of cause and effect applies equally to a Buddha as to anyone else. It's just they have created all of the karma that is outside of samsara, what we would call uncontaminated karma. So they basically have created their own results that they are experiencing in perpetuity because of the power of their realization, and putting an end to all of the results that are trapped within this cycle of existence, going from life to life. It's kind of an interesting concept in some regard, but to not take this principle of karma and apply it only to what we have here, this conditioned existence of samsara, but to understand it as an operative principle that will help us to achieve Buddhahood, will help us to achieve our own nirvana, will help us to achieve even good results within samsara. So this is the full understanding of karma, is getting all the different levels and its application as if you want the result that you're seeking, then you have to put the causes in place. And if you want to avoid the results you don't want, then you have to cease creating those causes.
Exactly. Okay.
So the fourth point is really understanding, as the last time I was here, we talked extensively about the Four Noble Truths, and it's really understanding the faults of cyclic existence, the very first noble truth, that as long as we continue to perpetuate this state through our ignorance, through this whole pattern of that giving rise to delusions, and then the karma that keeps us bound within cyclic existence, as long as we keep doing that, we're going to experience dissatisfaction, what the Buddha called dukkha, which means that the whole thing, we never find any real peace or satisfaction in samsara. So understanding all of these, it kind of forms a platform to understand then the various applications when Atisha gets into the 7 points, the rest of the 7 points, and how we can use an understanding of those basic teachings of the Buddha to work meaningfully with this life and with everything we meet in this life.
Brings us into the second point, the practice.
So the practice. Yeah, practice is traditionally presented in terms of these two minds that we're trying to overcome. So again, just to reiterate, we have the mind of self-grasping and this mind of self-centeredness, self-preoccupation. The more practical ones, again, are going to be in that second category, but even in this section, again, there are these statements, these slogans or proverbs that are like, treat everything you perceive as a dream, kind of recognizing the illusory nature of things. This is to help us to understand that our way of holding things to exist in this very concrete, independent way needs to be overcome as we go about our actions throughout the day, as well as the deeper level of work we do in meditation and analysis, and really trying to get to that point and a deeper understanding of it. But we have to begin to lessen our hold on everything, as you said earlier, the grasping, the craving. It even is happening at that level every day when we're holding things to have these independent identities. And we see it's particularly in regard to our relationships to other people. We encounter somebody who to us is unpleasant, they're appearing in that way. Well, we hold them to be an inherently unpleasant person, not sort of recognizing the illusion that's going on there, which is our own karma creating that experience of an unpleasant encounter with somebody, whereas we can certainly see, and even in conventional wisdom, that not everyone has that same experience with that person.
So it's our own personal lesson being presented to us based
Absolutely.
upon some other actions at another time and place.
Absolutely. And so if we bring these proverbs, these understandings into our daily life, we'd start lessening some of that hold onto things as being independently existent, as having these inherent entities that we're projecting onto the scenario. And it's totally our stuff. Not denying that the other person's not doing something. They are doing something.
They're being.
But they're being what they are, and we're
Exactly.
interpreting it in regard to our own point of view. And so that is, again, these points in the second topic of practice, this first level is really understanding that ultimate nature of things and trying to apply it all the time as much as we can. The second part of it, again, is to overcome the self-cherishing, preoccupation. And this is where we get into one of the most profound techniques that's taught in the mind training of Atisha, which is the practice of Tonglen, taking and giving, which is one of the proverbs that I don't know if you had it on your sheet or not, but it's an implication of, in some of the other points, the one in particular where you say you start with yourself.
Yeah.
So the advice always is to start developing compassion and love for yourself. And so that means understanding your own situation in terms of those preliminary points that we talked about, understanding how this is our fundamental purpose here is to open our hearts. And we have to begin to open our hearts first towards ourselves.
You can't give away what you don't have.
Exactly. And if you don't have a good understanding of what you're wishing for others, if you haven't applied that to yourself, how could you apply it for others? So the idea in the second part of this second point is that we want to eventually develop what's called the mind of awakening, or Bodhichitta. This is the sort of driving force of the Bodhisattva, the Mahayana practitioner who wants to go all the way to Buddhahood. Well, this is a very altruistic state of mind, and it's one where you become focused on the welfare of others. So what I was trying to say, and maybe my words weren't quite right, but if we really want something for others, and this mind is solely preoccupied with that, how do I help others to have happiness? How do I help them to be free from suffering? Well, first we have to apply that to ourselves. If we don't understand that for ourselves, very difficult to get it for others.
Yeah.
So this technique of taking and giving can be done as an exercise where we actually work with ourselves, kind of removing ourselves from ourselves, taking an objective look at ourselves as a suffering sentient being and a being that wants happiness. And this process of Tonglen, again, it's taught in many different ways. One teacher in the Kagyu tradition, Pema Chodron, is quite known for a lot of her approaches to Tonglen. But the idea is we begin by thinking very courageously about removing the suffering of that being, whoever we're working with, and sort of placing it on our self-cherishing mind, because this is what we're trying to destroy at this level, this conventional practice, is to really get rid of all of that self-preoccupation, putting me first. So it sounds strange to be, I'm working with myself, but I'm trying to overcome my self-cherishing. But it's a hard process, but if we don't start getting it in terms of identifying suffering in ourselves, again, very hard to get it in regard to others.
Well, it sounds like what you're talking about is, in not practical terms, but in everyday terms, is humility.
Yeah, humility, and I think generating a sense of a kind of selfless servitude, if you will. I mean, and it sounds strange to say that, but the idea is that, again, I'll kind of jump a little bit to another point that comes up in Atisha's training, but His Holiness the Dalai Lama often comments that these techniques and this idea of generating this aspiration to help others and to remove this tendency to cherish ourselves and to begin to cherish others is the way to be wisely selfish. You know, we admit that there's some selfish concern at some level in all of us, and we're all starting with that fundamental drive for happiness and to avoid suffering. And there's kind of nothing wrong at some level of that. It's just how we go about doing that. Well, His Holiness is saying, let's do it wisely. If we're going to be concerned about ourselves, let's find the proper way to do it and not go after these techniques that only lead to more suffering, only lead to more confusion. So these techniques of kind of selfless servitude or humility are really about putting ourselves in a position where we will put others first, where we think of them as being the primary concern. And what the teachings say is that that's actually the way that our needs are met. And as I was saying earlier, this whole idea we've gotten into of everyone cherishing themselves and going after their piece of the pie, and in the end, no one really getting satisfied. Whereas if we were all concerned about everyone else getting a piece of the pie, everyone would be satisfied.
And you keep what you have by giving it away.
Exactly.
And at some point you probably enhance what you have by giving it away.
Yeah. And this comes down to the principles of karma, which again, as one of those preliminaries, it's a fundamental thing to understand. The karma of generosity is receiving. You know, so your actions of giving are the reason why you receive, why you have resources, wealth, and so on. So there's nothing that is produced for no reason, and the reasons always have to do with selfless concern, with like giving to others and not being selfish and miserly and holding on to ourselves.
Giving without the expectation of the return, but accepting the return graciously.
Exactly, acknowledging that that's simply how it works.
Yeah.
And then always having that cycle of what I receive is what I give, what I receive is what I give, and understanding that in that cycle of generosity, you know, that's really how it works. And the same thing happens for all the other practices of the Bodhisattva that are mentioned in that first quote by Atisha. You know, those are basically the 6 paramitas that he's referring to there, the 6 perfections. And all of them are revolving around this idea of when I begin to be concerned about others, this compassion, and I unite it with that wisdom, this emptiness, whose essence is compassion. This is the key. This is everything comes down to these two things that offset these two minds. The wisdom of emptiness offsets our self-grasping. The compassion offsets our self-cherishing, this self-preoccupation. So one works on kind of a conventional level in terms of how we are able to accomplish anything is by being focused on others. The other one is working at this deeper ultimate level where we begin to get rid of the whole delusion that we're living our lives by. And so it's quite profound. I mean, when we get into these teachings, it's really pretty amazing what Atisha's put together in regard to this text.
Some of this stuff is amazing. And what you're saying leads me right into the third point, which is using adversity to wake up.
Right.
And Robert Thurman has a beautiful quote. It says, "Don't worry, there's nothing real about your confusion." I love that.
Yeah, and this is actually where I think, these teachings, this is the pith of them, if you will. It's really to understand that everything that we meet is grist for the mill, as they say. Everything is an opportunity to awaken. And so we have a tendency, once again, because of these two concepts that are going on, the self-cherishing mind that thinks, I don't deserve to experience this and I don't want to experience this, and so much resistance to pain and difficulty in our lives. And then the self-grasping, that is what's at the root of it, that holds on to some self that is being fundamentally wounded in the process, and that self doesn't even exist. So this idea of, again, understanding that it doesn't really exist in the way that we think it does, what Robert Thurman's saying in that point of understanding where it's all coming from, and not giving it so much energy. This is the problem, is we give things so much energy. I'm constantly amazed, how many times there'll be something that comes up in the news and about somebody taking what one person says in a particular way, and then it becomes a whole campaign that eventually you have the whole media paying attention to it, because they're putting so much energy into things as if, again, they have that sort of intrinsic nature, and they're not really understanding that all these things are simply dependent arisings, and they're an opportunity, again, for us to work with it.
To learn.
Exactly.
So there's nothing real about my confusion. It's what that's saying to me. If coming from a mind training,
right,
is that if I change my perception of what I see or feel or experience,
right,
it changes.
Absolutely. I think, to quote Pema Chodron again, I've listened to a number of her teachings, and her recent teachings, she likes to use this word, reframe, which we were talking about earlier, Buddha being the great cognitive therapist.
Which is reframing your experiences.
Exactly. And this is where we can reframe in so many ways, and that's why a lot of the slogans in that section are really quite nice, because they point to different ways that we can work with things. But the idea, and the fundamental way that we can work with them, is just at that understanding of karma. Again, if I think that in a particular situation where somebody's confronting me, that it's my karma that created that in essence, the other person's simply a condition for me to experience the ripening of my own past action, then there goes the blame. There goes any of that, putting the onus on the other person, because I'm a key part of that.
It's my interpretation of it.
Exactly.
I mean, in its most simplistic form, I mean, it's about how the Tibetan people perceived the invasion of China.
Exactly.
They could have labeled it any number of things, and they just chose to see it as this was supposed to happen, and that's it. I'm not going to,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is an incredible example of that, in terms of the way that he's been able to deal with being in exile from his own homeland, and this was an amazing transformation of the Western world that's occurred because of his exile.
Exactly.
And so there's always, again, an opportunity within any adverse situation we meet. And so are we willing to look at it and to learn from it, as you say? And that's a key lesson, getting the understanding of karma, getting the understanding of the suffering of cyclic existence. If every time I experience something that makes me feel some pain, some difficulty, well, it opens my heart more, because I recognize the universality of that pain and difficulty.
Can I suggest that the use of the term homeland creates that problem?
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is my homeland. No, my homeland is wherever I am.
There's a wonderful set of verses that are in this Lojong tradition to a great extent, called the 37 Practices of a Bodhisattva, and one of the practices of the Bodhisattva is to abandon one's homeland. I mean, and it means the whole concept of a homeland. It means everything entailed in what we hold to so dearly as some sense of kind of security. Pema Chodron, and to kind of apply this on the other side of it in terms of the security that we crave in our self-grasping mind, she likes to use the term groundlessness for emptiness, which I really kind of like, because this is, we seek ground, we seek something solid, we seek something that we can rely on, something that we feel is, oh, now I've got it, it's all safe and secure. Well, the Buddha says, don't look for it there. You're looking in the totally wrong place, and it really doesn't exist anyway. And you have to sort of abandon yourself to the reality of impermanence and emptiness and this groundlessness that I think is really a part of the experience of understanding emptiness, to not seek what we tend to be driven by so often, something that we can rely upon in this concrete way.
Let's roll into point number 4, because I want to try to get all 7 in if we can. Life and death. Work with the 5 forces, practice these 5 forces, and you are ready for death at any moment. What are the 5 forces?
The 5 forces, there are 5 forces you can, in this tradition, they say you practice them through your life, and then at the time of death they might take on a slightly different flavor, but they are the maturation of those processes. So I don't know if I'll touch on all 5, but one of the key ones is intention, which means that we have to have a strong motivation and intention with every day of our lives. Now again, in these teachings, it very much goes back to this mind of Bodhichitta, this awakening spirit, this mind of enlightenment, that is this fundamental desire to make one's life's purpose to benefit others through becoming enlightened oneself. So if we live our lives with that intention every day, then when we reach our death, that intention will be in our mind and will be something that we carry into the death process, so that everything that transpires will be of a much more wholesome nature and more fruitful. There's another one called the power of the white seed, which has to do with our adoption of virtuous action in our lives. Again, virtue is here not meant to be in a moralistic tone. It's simply looking at it in the Buddha's observation on the principle of karma is these results lead to happiness, these results lead to what we call suffering. So you choose. And if the power of the white seed is really adopting that path that leads to planting more of those virtuous seeds. There's also the power of familiarization, which is this force that helps us to be much more acquainted with everything we're trying to practice, once again, so that at the time of death, that familiarization allows us to die with more peace and with a mind that will move on to another existence that will be more beneficial. But these 5 forces are, again, very powerful ways to make every day of our lives quite meaningful. I think the other 2 are the power of prayer and the power of, let's look at my notes, the sort of rejecting the negative actions. So we have that adopting the virtuous ones through the power of the white seed, and then kind of counteracting all the negativities that we normally have in our lives.
Which all flow from my intentions.
Exactly.
Yes, my intention is create
This is
my
why
reality.
the very first one of the force of intention is so important. If you every day you wake up, and even just to have the simple thought, may today what I do be a benefit to others. It doesn't have to be kind of in this spiritual context of enlightenment and bodhicitta and all these terms I'm talking about, but just acknowledging that that's a key way that we begin to let go of at least some of that self-cherishing, some of that preoccupation with me, myself, and I. And what we will find, if we follow that truly, and we really do live our lives for the sake of others, is that we actually end up being so much more satisfied ourselves. Look at His Holiness. I mean, amazing example of somebody who is always joyful and always in just an incredible, peaceful state of mind. So I think there's proof right there that this is the path that leads to inner well-being by practicing abandoning concern for oneself and adopting concern for others. So.
Which segues us right into number 5, which is yardsticks. And one of the things Thurman says is follow the inner witness rather than the outer ones.
Yeah.
It's what's going on inside as opposed to you tell me how I'm doing.
Well, and the thing is, we can often get mistaken if we don't really listen to the right voice, because on the outside, and sometimes even in our interactions with people, there might be a little bit of that, hypocritical stuff going on where we're pretending to be something more than we are, and so we might be getting lots of praise from people saying, "You've improved so much, Reverend Phil. You're such a kind, wonderful person."
Which feeds my ego.
And then you kind of get this inflated ego, and we don't recognize the work that needs to be done.
Exactly.
So this is the point: is to really be honestly listening to that inner voice. Not again, using our delusional sides of our inner voices, which we've been following for so long, but find that really honest one that's speaking truth. And in that way, we will make great progress and not get caught up in, again, these patterns of arrogance and what have you.
I think there's a Zen teaching, which I don't know if it comes into Tibetan Buddhism as well, but it's like student going to the teacher asking a question, and the teacher's asking, who's asking the question? Which part of you is asking this question? It's like, I'm asking this question. No, which one of you is asking who's asking the question?
Yeah, I think that's a key point. We have to say, well, where are these things coming from?
Yeah.
The teacher I mentioned earlier, Venerable Rabina, she was in a teaching I was in with her. There was one student asking questions, and she just said to the person, just listen to yourself. Just listen to yourself. That was the only answer she would give, because I think at some point we do have to listen to ourselves at a deeper level than what we currently are.
So number 6 is commitments, and it talks about observing 3 points, and another great one here, don't abuse your divine power for selfish reasons. Which is...
I think the phrase that it's in different, again, there's different translations of these slogans or proverbs, and I think the one that gets translated in other ways, it's the exact same verse, but again, translated slightly differently, is don't make gods into demons. So we have this tendency, and this is again where arrogance and pride often come in, and where delusions of what we think we've achieved versus what we really have, and so all of a sudden we're making something which is supposed to be about really helping us change in a more positive way into something that really just defeats its purpose. And in that way, we are the only ones to blame for it, because we're the ones that are using these things erroneously. We're making them into demons as opposed to something that really will help us to improve our lives.
This don't abuse your divine power for selfish reasons. I'm a big believer, follower of Edgar Cayce. I don't know how familiar you are with Edgar Cayce. He was a psychic that died in the late 40s. And one of his statements, he did I don't want to get too deep into this. We did like 14,500 psychic readings. So, each reading could have been anywhere from 2-3 sentences to 20-25 sentences. But somebody had asked him what is original sin. And he said, original sin is to use the creative force for selfish reasons.
Exactly. That's hitting the nail right on the head. If we use these and all we do is increase our self-concern and increase our grasping at a self, well then, we've really missed the boat. Atisha's just kind of gently reminding us that don't run askew with this, because if you do, you're really in trouble.
And the other one was good also, is don't expect to profit from other people's misfortune. That's again the reflection of the ego. It's total selfishness.
And we see how often we rejoice in the misfortune of our enemies, and quote, the people who we don't like, and this is really one of the worst ways to again feed the delusions, is by not looking at things in a way that is really constructive. And so, it's a very important slogan to follow. One of the major commitments.
It's taken us again, showing us not only what to do, but it's a reflection of selflessness and ego. I don't care what happens to you as long as I benefit from it.
Right. This is where one of the fundamental meditations that's done in these techniques for developing bodhicitta is around developing equanimity. We see how much pain there is in the world because there is no equanimity, because people do get divided into these, well, we call them the 3 categories of friend, enemy, and stranger, but we have obviously grades within that. Enemy is a pretty strong word, but we have everything from the person who's a minor irritation in our lives to the person who might end up threatening our lives at some level. And so because of that, we have three afflictions towards them. We have strong attachment and this clinging to the friends, the people who are very dear to us, and we have this strong aversion and even hatred towards the enemies, and then we have an indifference towards everyone else. Well, these are 3 minds that are all obstacles to what we're trying to develop in the mind training. And so this is a key point in terms of if we start looking at our enemies or other people and rejoice in their misfortune, take delight in the things that happen to them that are, again, totally against the grain of what we would like for all sentient beings eventually, well then we're ruining it. We're really messing with these fundamental principles of having an equal mind, even-mindedness towards all beings.
So would it be fair to say, within the context of what we've been discussing, the stronger my reaction to something or somebody, the greater the lesson there is for me?
Stronger my reaction, the greater the lesson. I guess we'd have to go back to, again, I don't know, to talk a little bit more about what you mean by that, because I think we have to define, well, how is it that we're reacting? If we say the stronger the reaction.
Any reaction.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's certainly...
Wouldn't mean the more emotional I get, isn't there more attachment to it?
Well, the affliction certainly becomes heightened, but it's not to say that we necessarily would learn the lesson at a greater level. It's hard to say. I think that there's lessons we could learn even when the afflictions are not at such a strong level, obviously. And I think one of the things that happens to us is that we probably, when the afflictions get stronger, we might learn the lesson a little bit easier simply because the ramifications are so much greater. I mean, compare the times when you've been minorly annoyed with somebody versus the times when you've had a major blowout with somebody, particularly somebody very close to you, and then the repairing of the relationship from that very painful place of confronting anger is always so much more difficult than when it's just the minor things. And so we might really get the lesson at that level where it's at that strong point of anger that, oh wow, I mean, I really do see the suffering involved in here because it's affected me as well.
And I may not always get the lesson, but I mean, I think I'm saying is the stronger my reactions to it, the more I need to really work with that. I may not necessarily choose to work with that, but...
Yeah. Well, and this is where one of the mind training slogans is to kind of, work on that which is the greatest source of our discomfort, displeasure, whatever. I am basically looking at that's the starting point. And the reason it's a starting point is because it's the one that we really do need to start curbing the behavior. Otherwise, it's going to take over, and it already is in a place where it's more or less taking over. So certainly, in that regard, the stronger emotion that we have, the more it should be our focal point for the practice.
Let's go right into the last one. Don't want to get down to the end of time here, the show at least. So the 7th point is guidelines. So this is taking all the rest of everything we've just talked about and putting it into a structure, so to speak?
Well, in a sense, it's kind of advice on how to practice these, what we've seen above, in a sense, giving us a little bit more to work with. And there's actually quite a few slogans in that 7th point, traditionally. It's, I think, the largest section of them. And so it's all sorts of wonderful little things to keep us from going astray in regard to it, making sure that we're doing the training correctly.
There are a couple here that really pop out to me. Accept good and bad fortune with an equal mind. Not to attach to either one of them. If we attach, if I'm defining it, my ego's involved again. And
Exactly.
It's about self. It's opposed to seeing this just is.
Yeah, exactly. And we see that the reactions, and this is what happens in most of our lives, when things are going really well, we get quite complacent and keep holding on to it as if this is how it's always going to be, and then the pain is so much greater because things change. And then when things are bad, we have so much resistance that we can't wait for it to get good that we just don't even learn anything in those situations. We just have this aversion energy. So I'm always reminded in that proverb of the story of the Taoist farmer, which I don't need to share all of it, but it's the idea of, he loses a horse.
And the horse comes back with a bunch of horses.
But his neighbor keeps saying, oh, how unfortunate. And then the horse comes back with another horse, and he goes, oh, how good. And the Taoist farmer keeps saying, who
knows what's good or bad.
Exactly. We can't, and why get so attached to good or bad? Why not, again, if we really start getting these lessons, good or bad is a subjective label being put on the situation, and it's usually coming from a place of ignorance.
And it's coming from a place of, one, not seeing the continuity of life. So right now, in this moment, this is how I judge this to be, so I shouldn't be judging it because more is always revealed.
Exactly. Yeah.
The other one here, it's two more I'd like to touch on. Keep your vows even at the risk of your life. I mean, that's exactly what we were just talking a little bit about when the Chinese came in. We're not going to give up what we believe in. We may move it and carry it someplace else, but...
Well, and I think again, when we take, because this is referring to the commitments of mind training itself, that we looked at earlier, as well as the Bodhisattva vows, which are a key part of this tradition, at least in the Mahayana tradition. And if we really have the sincere intention, going back to that again, then these vows become a way that we guard that intention. And so to let that guard down would be antithetical to, again, what our primary intention is. So it's very much related. If we have the strong intention, then we will be dearly holding those vows, even at the cost of our lives.
And the other one, always meditate on whatever you resent.
Yeah, this is the point of kind of, when things come up that are just they are what pushes your buttons. They are what causes you difficulty. They are the situations that, we have total resentment, total disillusionment at that time. This is when we really need to apply the meditation. And, to acknowledge that there's always additional stuff. I think, again, I wish I could remember the exact quote from Pema Chodron, but she said, there's always something to work with. And at some level, we always keep acknowledging that there's deeper and deeper levels to work with. And so if we're experiencing resentment, certainly, then that becomes the focal point.
And without getting too deep into it, but resentment is a reflection of an expectation.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the final point, which is always great, is don't expect any applause. Ends with that. I mean, sums it all up. This ain't about you.
Exactly. And if that's why we're in it, is for the applause, well then,
yes, really.
Once again, we missed the boat.
If you're in it for the applause, get a TV show. We're having too much fun.
Well, these are just such tasty little things. I mean, this is why I was delighted to be invited to come back here to work with this text, because if we do even work with one of these slogans, each day or something, you'd find that your life starts getting more spacious and more joyous.
Yes.
There's so much joy. Well, actually, one of the proverbs is, to do everything with a joyful mind, to maintain a joyful mind. This practice is about joy and opening up to life, as opposed to shutting down and being in this tight, narrow, self-focused way. So I encourage people to practice these as much as they can.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're here for. That's why we're putting this out there. Let's bounce. You want to give out some contact information?
Sure. So again, I teach at Tupten Norberling Buddhist Center. This is located in Santa Fe at 149 East Alameda. We don't have a phone there at the location, but we do have a phone, 505-660-7056, that you can call and leave any information, and we'll get back to you. We have programs on Sunday mornings that are about beginning teachings in Buddhism. It's our Discovering Buddhism program. And then we have an ongoing series on Wednesday nights that are a little more advanced on what's called the basic program. But we're dealing with, I mentioned earlier, the Lam Rim tradition of Atisha. We teach in that, but Lojong is kind of taught as part of that as well. We actually have a course coming up on mind training that will start in December on Sundays. And we'll be looking there at another text that's called The 8 Verses of Training the Mind by Geshe Langri Tangpa, which is a really wonderful text, one of His Holiness the Dalai Lama's favorites. So that will be in December going into January, actually, because we've got the Christmas break in there. That'll interrupt that course. But
wonderful. And if you missed the contact, I think we're flashing it on the screen. I believe we are, but if you've missed it and you can't catch it, contact me and I will be happy to provide it for you. Couple of things I want to invite you as an audience to participate in. Next week is going to be our Thanksgiving show. We record on Mondays. It's going to be Monday the 23rd around 2 o'clock at the TV studio at the College of Santa Fe. Santa Fe Community College, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. Santa Fe Community College on Richards. If you want to come in, we're going to have an hour show. We're going to have an open door policy. You want to come in and express your gratefulness and your thankfulness, we'd be happy to put you on the air, or you could email me something that you want me to say or read for you. Or if you're really high tech, you could use your cell phone to take a picture and email it to me, and we'll take that picture and create a video out of it and air it. So you're all welcome to partake of that. Also, I'm inviting you to send any comments you have about the show, things you'd like to hear, things you don't want to hear, criticisms. I can handle it. I don't have much of an ego. But I'd like to hear from you is what you think about the show, what you're hearing, and what topics you'd like for me to explore. Also, I do spiritual counseling, so I believe completely and totally that without a spiritual component, we do not heal. We cannot solve our problem with the same instrument that creates that problem. And I'm not here to push any agenda. Those who watch the show know that I honor all agendas, I honor all faiths, I honor all paths. They're all, to me, they lead to the same place. So, if you're having problems with something and need some help, give me a call, send me an email, be happy to work with you. I work on a donation basis. So don't forget, next week is Thanksgiving, and it'll be a great show. Parting thought.
Parting thought. Wow. I don't know.
You know that by now. We do.
I think I've given you most of my thoughts, but
okay.
But yeah, I know. I think that again, to go back to this idea of really explore: are we being wisely selfish? Are we really understanding how it is that our needs are met? And this is a profound teaching that His Holiness gives, and opening up to the reality that others are a part of our well-being and our happiness, and in that way to find some measure of peace and happiness through that exploration.
Wonderful. One of the things that last time we ended the show, I asked if you wanted to do this show, and so I'm going to end the show asking you for another show. Because we touched on it quite a bit, and I think it's worthy of a whole show. But again, I'm not totally familiar with the school that you practice. I don't know how these fit into it, but Tibetan Book of the Dead and Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Would we interest you in coming back and...
Maybe we can find a topic within that to talk about. Maybe we can talk about death in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And
yeah.
It's a good thing for people to explore, I think. There's some interesting teachings there.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. Because I've done one show on dying in hospice earlier on when I first started, and I think it is an important subject. How do we approach it, and how do we deal with it? How do we prepare for it, even? So.
Absolutely. Be happy to come back and discuss that with you, Reverend Phil.
Love it. We'll do that maybe after the first of the year, somewhere into early next year. Don't want people to think that you're going to always be here. So.
Good. I'll be looking forward to it.
As am I. I thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
It's a pleasure having you. I'm glad you agreed to do these things. I hope the audience enjoys them as much as I do. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I hope you get something out of this show, because there was lots of information here. So until next week, know that you create your own reality. That is one thing that every one of you are capable of doing. You do it with your intentions. You do it with your beliefs. If reality isn't working for you, change it. That's what mindfulness is about. So until next week, love and light and blessings to you all. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.